Here in Module 5, Lecture 4, we're going to be looking at phylogenetic approaches to religious history, so techniques that try to trace out trees of descent among religious beliefs or practices. So let's begin by getting clearer about what a phylogeny is and how one goes about putting one together by turning again to Quentin Atkinson and Russell Gray.
Now, a phylogeny, I think it's from the Greek birth of tribes, and that was initially applied to biology. In biology, phylogenies, the representation of the genealogical relationships between species. They're like a species family tree. So it's kind of nice that we're applying phylogenetics, these methods that were developed in biology, back to the birth of tribes, if you like, to cultural evolution. So the language phylogeny tells us about the process of descent with modification that gave rise to the different cultures across the Pacific. So there are different ways of constructing phylogenies. In biology, biologists to work out how species are related would use genetic variation. We're tracking cultures, so we want some cultural traits that are inherited and we can model. And language is a really good marker there. So we can use the words for different concepts in a region to work out how the languages are related.
And we can build up these family trees by looking at words and homologous words, what linguists call cognate words. So words that have a common origin. We look at basic vocabulary actually, and we look at that for a good reason, and that is that it has low rates of borrowing. So when we look at English, roughly 60% of English is borrowed from Romance languages, but only 6% of the basic vocabulary is.
And what are words that are part of the basic vocabulary? Number words?
Number words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, body parts,
okay.
Kinship terms, mother, father, that kind of thing.
So those tend to be very conservative.
Conservative in that they don't change that rapidly, so you've still got historical signal, and conservative in they're not promiscuously borrowed all over the place.
Okay.
So some words, like words for hand, are really, really widespread. It's rima or lima over most of Austronesian, and some are much more restricted. So
if we see a word like hand that seems to be widely shared by all of these languages, what does that suggest about chronology?
Well, it suggests that it probably came from a fairly ancient proto-language, say the original proto-language of Austronesian spoken in Taiwan maybe 5,000 years ago. So we can see reflexes, forms that descend from that all throughout the Austronesian family. So one of the nice things we can do is triangulate different lines of evidence. You can compare with archaeology and you can compare with genetics. And increasingly there's a beautiful fit between what you see archaeologically and what we see in these language family trees. And in the words that are spoken in these communities today, there's a remarkably fine-grained kind of history all locked up in the language of these communities.
So the convergent results from different sources of evidence give you confidence that the language phylogeny is accurate?
Yes. Now that won't always be the case. That's one of the nice things about the Pacific and about Austronesia. I mean, there'll be some parts of the world where cultural histories and demographic genetic histories don't go together, but to a large extent in the Pacific at least they do.
So in Lecture 3, we've already talked about how Drs. Atkinson and Gray and their colleagues used their phylogeny and their database in combination. So they were able to lay this language phylogeny on top of their database of religious characteristics and therefore get at not just variation, but variation in time. So get a sense of which religious ideas and practices came first and which later on, which in turn gives you some sense of causality. So it's very powerful to combine phylogenetic techniques with databasing techniques. Another way to use phylogenetic techniques is to use them to adjudicate between competing hypotheses about religious descent. So where cultural traits came from. Did they come from one original source and then spread out and change over time, or were they invented independently in different places and blend together? So a nice example of this kind of analysis is a study done by Luke Matthews and colleagues. They were using slightly different methods of constructing phylogenies than Quentin Atkinson and Russell Gray used, but it's the same basic principle. They were using these techniques to look at Iranian textiles. So there's debate in the field of Iranian textile studies about where these tribal patterns come from. So there's a model where there was one core tradition, and then all of the variation we see today is a result of descent and variation from that core tradition. And another model where it's really independent centers were developing their own models, and these blended together in various ways. So in order to adjudicate between these two different hypotheses, they took the existing variation that we can observe and laid different phylogenetic trees on top of it to see which was more likely, which tree more likely predicted the existing variation that we see. And it seems that the multiple origins hypothesis is more likely. The tree that purports to have a core tradition that then varies through descent doesn't seem to fit statistically the current data of diversity that we have. Another nice example of use of phylogenetic techniques is a study by Jamie Tirani, one of the co-authors on the Iranian textile study. He was looking at folklore. So he was looking at actually the Little Red Riding Hood story. So folklorists know that this Little Red Riding Hood story is widespread. So certainly throughout Europe and possibly similar stories in Africa and East Asia. And so one of the questions is this a story that arose in one place and then spread through diffusion to these other areas we see it? Is it actually related to similar stories? So there's another type that folklorists talk about called the wolf and the kids. So there's several questions. Are these distinct stories? Are they different enough that they seem like they really are distinct stories? And if so, did they originate in one place and spread, or did they arise independently in different parts of the world? What they found is that the existing African versions of the tale actually seem to be a distinct type. They seem to descend from a distinct wolf and the kids story that originated in Africa, whereas the East Asian stories seem to be a blend of this wolf and the kids story and the Little Red Riding Hood story that initiated in Europe. So it's a very interesting way to untangle the lines of descent of stories. And you can see how this has important implications for cultural transmission, cultural history more generally. So there have been several studies that have applied these techniques to religious cultures, so the inheritance of religious traits, whether behavior or beliefs. One of the more interesting was also led by Luke Matthews, and it was looking at 16th century Anabaptists. So there are a lot of these different Anabaptist sects that were competing with one another, they were communicating with one another. One of the things this team was interested in is the extent to which theological beliefs are transmitted horizontally. So are these groups sharing these ideas and are they learning them from one another, or are they inherited through descent? Is a particular sect getting its beliefs from its parent sect, so from the people who came before, or is it getting it essentially from its peers? Is it learning horizontally from other groups? And so they modeled different elements of theological beliefs of these different groups and found that while most theological elements of a group's belief system were diffused horizontally, so they were shared and learned from others, one in particular, the degree of religious violence that was advocated was actually inherited from the parent group. So this seems to be a trait that's not diffused, it's actually inherited genealogically from the parent group, which has very interesting implications about whether or not religious violence as a trait behaves differently than other religious beliefs and practices. As a humanities scholar, what I find so exciting about these techniques is the basic questions that phylogenies can answer. So where do cultural traits come from? Are they the result of multiple sources that blend together in some way? Are they really the result of a single source that just altered, that changed over time? These are basic questions that we ask all the time and questions that we speculate about all the time. We haven't had actually very good tools for answering these types of questions. So the combination of actually the two techniques that we've looked at in the past two lectures. So in lecture 3, we've talked about this idea of large databases, so big data sets of essentially cultural traits. So you get a big database of different groups and what traits they have. Once you have that kind of database, you can use tools like phylogenetic analysis to lay on top of that various types of trees and actually organize this data set, see how these traits fit together, see what the dynamics of transmission have been. And this is a very exciting thing. This is a way of answering in a much more rigorous way questions that we've always had as scholars of religion. Where do religious beliefs come from? How do religious groups change over time? So phylogenetic analysis itself is quite complicated. It involves very complicated statistics. And so it's always going to involve people working in teams. So people who have the historical knowledge, who are able to understand the significance of different types of cultural traits, working together with people with the mathematical skills. But this is an instance of how large-scale new techniques can really help change religious studies. So we can start examining the historical record with a kind of rigor we've never had before. In lecture 5, we're going to turn to another of these very powerful techniques, mathematical techniques for analyzing large data sets, whether textual archives or historical databases, the use of computer modeling and agent-based modeling.